It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in the quiet town of Glenwood. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting a soft golden hue over the streets. Mrs. Williams, a woman in her late 70s, stepped out of her small, cozy home, adjusting her glasses and tying her shoes. She was used to this routine: a brisk walk to the local market, a chat with the friendly shopkeepers, a stop by the community center to help with preparations for the upcoming neighborhood event. To most people in Glenwood, Mrs. Williams was an unassuming figure. A widow for many years, she had raised her 2 children with love and determination. Now, in her golden years, she had earned the respect and admiration of her neighbors. She was known for her kindness, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice. Though not officially involved in politics, she had always been a quiet advisor to her husband, who was the mayor of Glenwood. Her wisdom and life experience made her a trusted figure in the community, even if her role was often behind the scenes. As she made her way down Maple Street, Mrs. Williams took a deep breath, savoring the fresh morning air. She was looking forward to her usual routine, but little did she know, this was the day that would change everything. Officer Harris, the newest addition to the Glenwood police force, was on his patrol shift. He had only recently moved to the town from a much larger city, still unfamiliar with the tight-knit community. Though eager to make a good impression, Harris struggled with the slow pace of the small town. On his rounds, he had already been warned by some of the older officers that Glenwood was a place where everyone knows everyone, but he hadn't quite grasped what that meant. He was still learning the names and faces of the residents, but the truth was, he felt out of place, an outsider in a town that held its traditions tightly. As Mrs. Williams passed the corner of 5th and Oak, she didn't notice the squad car that had pulled up a few feet behind her. Officer Harris, noticing an elderly woman walking alone at that hour, decided to stop and check in. His instincts told him there might be something off about the situation, perhaps it was a petty suspicion, but in the city he came from, elderly women out alone so early weren't always a common sight. He rolled down his window, watching Mrs. Williams with a sharp gaze. "Excuse me, ma'am," Harris called out, his voice firm but respectful. Mrs. Williams turned around, surprised by the officer's sudden appearance. She adjusted her glasses again and smiled politely. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" "I'm just checking in," Harris said, trying to appear friendly but still distant. "You're walking alone this early. Everything all right?" Mrs. Williams chuckled softly, the hint of a smile still on her face. "I'm fine, officer. Just running my usual errands. I've lived here for years, dear. No trouble for me." But Officer Harris, still new and overly cautious, wasn't convinced. Something about the exchange made him uneasy. Was it the way she responded too quickly, or was it the fact that he hadn't seen her around before? In his mind, this was a good opportunity to make sure nothing suspicious was going on. "Can I see some ID, ma'am?" he asked abruptly. Mrs. Williams blinked in surprise, feeling the shift in his tone. "ID? What do you mean?" "Just need to confirm who you are," Harris said, his posture stiffening. "I'm just doing my job." Mrs. Williams, now confused and a little taken aback, reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet, still not fully understanding the officer's request. "I'm Mrs. Williams," she said, showing her identification. "I live right down the street. I'm just a local." But the officer didn't seem to hear her explanation. He took a moment to look over her ID, then looked up at her suspiciously. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm going to need you to step over to the car." Now alarmed, Mrs. Williams felt the anxiety creep up her spine. She didn't understand why the officer was acting this way. "What are you doing?" "I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, stepping back instinctively. Harris, his mind racing, struggled to keep his composure. "You're not cooperating, ma'am. I'm going to have to take you in for resisting arrest." The words echoed in her mind, but they made no sense. She hadn't done anything wrong, she was simply going about her day. Yet the officer was insistent. Her heart started pounding in her chest as she felt the weight of the situation beginning to spiral. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, not quite believing what was happening. Before she could say another word, Officer Harris reached forward to grab her arm, trying to pull her toward the car. The roughness of his touch startled her, and she pulled away. "Stop! Let go of me," she shouted, now feeling a wave of fear she hadn't experienced in years. A small crowd had begun to gather, people from the neighborhood who recognized her but stood uncertainly, unsure of how to intervene. Some muttered to themselves, others watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. As Harris struggled to maintain control of the situation, his frustration mounting, Mrs. Williams could only feel a growing sense of disbelief. She had lived a life of peace, raised her children with love and dignity, never once considering that her quiet, ordinary days could be interrupted like this. But now, it seemed, her world was suddenly crashing down. How had it come to this? Why was she, an elderly woman who had done nothing wrong, being treated like a criminal? The confusion was palpable in the air, both for Mrs. Williams and the growing crowd around them. But there was no turning back now. The officer had made his decision. And in the midst of it all, the quiet streets of Glenwood would never feel the same again. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Harris tried to maintain control of the situation. Mrs. Williams stood there, trembling with a mix of confusion, anger, and fear. Her heart raced as she struggled to process what was happening. The quiet neighborhood she had lived in for so many years now felt like a foreign place. The crowd, still standing at a distance, watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Some looked away, unsure if it was their place, while others exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether this was a misunderstanding or something more sinister. As Officer Harris tried to guide her toward the patrol car, Mrs. Williams stumbled, still in disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "This is wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong." Her words, though calm, were filled with the quiet anger that only years of experience could cultivate. But Harris wasn't listening. His grip tightened around her arm, forcing her toward the vehicle. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." "I'm just doing my job," Harris insisted, his voice losing its earlier firmness, now tinged with irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned. In his mind, he was only following procedure, yet deep down, he felt a rising sense of discomfort. He hadn't intended for the situation to escalate like this, but something about Mrs. Williams' resistance made him question his own actions. Mrs. Williams' frustration bubbled over. "You're making a mistake. I'm not some criminal," she shouted, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She pulled back again, her movements swift despite her age, but Harris was determined. He tried again to force her into the car, and for a moment, the two were caught in a silent standoff, the struggle between authority and a woman who refused to be intimidated. The crowd had grown larger now, a mixture of concerned neighbors, some recording the scene on their phones, others whispering among themselves. There was a tension in the air that had never existed in Glenwood before. This wasn't the kind of town where such things happened, not in broad daylight, not with someone like Mrs. Williams, who had lived in Glenwood for decades and had always been a well-respected, peaceful member of the community. But there was no denying what was happening now. The officer's grip was still firm on Mrs. Williams, and despite her protests, he was moving her toward the car. It was only when she finally took a step back, her body stiff with resistance, that something unexpected happened. Her daughter, Rachel, emerged from the crowd, rushing toward the officer. "Mom! What's going on?" Rachel called out, her voice filled with panic as she pushed through the onlookers. Rachel was in her 30s, and though she had always been protective of her mother, she had never imagined she would have to intervene in something like this. The sight of her mother being handled like a criminal, the shock on her face, made her stomach churn with anxiety. "Mom, are you all right?" Rachel reached out to touch her mother's arm, her voice trembling. "Why are they doing this to you?" Officer Harris glanced at Rachel, a sense of unease washing over him as he saw the recognition in her eyes. He paused, just for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Rachel had a fire in her, a sharp edge to her voice that made him feel out of place, suddenly aware of his own missteps. "Ma'am," he said, trying to regain his composure. "Your mother was resisting arrest." "I'm just trying to." "Resisting arrest?" Rachel interrupted, her voice rising with anger. "She was walking down the street. She's done nothing wrong." The crowd around them began to murmur louder now, some people stepping forward, speaking up in support of Mrs. Williams. But there were still others who stood back, unsure if they should get involved. It wasn't their place, they thought. But for Rachel, it wasn't just about standing up for her mother, it was about standing up for what was right. She could see the officer's unease, the way he shifted from foot to foot, as if unsure of his next move. "Officer, you've made a mistake," Rachel said, her voice now calm but filled with authority. "My mother is Mrs. Williams, the wife of Mayor Williams. She's lived here her whole life. You have no reason to treat her this way." The officer froze, his eyes widening slightly as the realization hit him. "Wait, you're Mrs. Williams," he stammered, finally seeing the full picture. "Yes, she is," Rachel said firmly, stepping closer to her mother. "She's a respected member of this community. She's done nothing wrong." Her voice carried a mix of disbelief and frustration, and she looked directly at the officer, daring him to argue further. The realization dawned on Harris slowly, as if the weight of his mistake was finally sinking in. Mrs. Williams had been well known around town, but he had never associated her with any political figure. The moment that should have been an easy conversation had spiraled out of control. He had acted on impulse, his training kicking in, not fully considering the context of the situation. As Rachel spoke, the onlookers grew more vocal, some stepping forward, others offering sympathetic glances. Some were now whispering that the officer should apologize, while others called for him to let Mrs. Williams go immediately. The tension in the air was palpable. I didn't know," Officer Harris said quietly, his voice faltering. His face reddened with embarrassment, but his pride kept him from fully apologizing. He didn't know what to say. The crowd was no longer on his side. Mrs. Williams, meanwhile, took a deep breath, her mind racing, as she silently weighed her next move. She could feel the weight of the moment, the judgment of the crowd, the recognition of her own family. "I'm not going to let this slide," she finally said, her voice steady. "This was wrong. I won't let it happen again." Rachel nodded, her anger simmering. She knew that this wasn't just about her mother. This was about the way people were treated, the assumptions made, and the systemic issues that plagued not just Glenwood, but towns all over the country. For the first time in years, Glenwood was facing a crossroads. The story of an elderly woman being wrongfully arrested by a young, overzealous officer was more than just an incident, it was a turning point for the community, one that no one would soon forget. And as Mrs. Williams looked around at the growing crowd, she realized that her life had just taken an unexpected turn, one that would change everything. The following day, Glenwood woke to a different atmosphere. The usual calm that defined the town was replaced by an undercurrent of tension, with people whispering in hushed tones about the events of the previous afternoon. Mrs. Williams' arrest had become the talk of the town, and though many were still in disbelief, others were coming to terms with the reality that this was no longer just an isolated incident. The entire town was now in the midst of an unfolding story, one that could change everything. In the Williams household, Rachel spent the morning in quiet contemplation. She had spent the night organizing her thoughts, reflecting on the chaos of the previous day. It wasn't just the arrest that disturbed her, it was the sense of helplessness that had washed over her as she watched her mother being treated like a criminal. Mrs. Williams, a woman who had spent her life serving her community, raising a family, and contributing in ways most people would never even know, had been reduced to a mere suspect in the eyes of Officer Harris. And while Rachel had stood up for her mother, the incident was far from over. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about the wrongful arrest of an elderly woman, it was a symptom of something much deeper, a problem that had been simmering beneath the surface of Glenwood for far too long. Rachel knew that her mother's position, as the wife of the town's mayor, gave her a unique platform to demand change, but the thought of using her family's influence didn't sit well with her. Still, something had to be done. No one, regardless of their status, should ever have to endure what her mother had gone through. As Rachel continued to reflect, she received a call that would set the course for the next chapter in this story. It was the mayor's office, and though she'd been expecting something like this, the conversation still shocked her. The mayor's office had received numerous calls from concerned citizens, and word had already spread across the local news outlets. Rachel's mind raced as she picked up the phone, dreading the inevitable questions about the incident. "Rachel, this is Caroline from the mayor's office," the voice on the other end of the line said, her tone measured but urgent. "We need to talk. The situation with your mother has escalated, and it's becoming a matter of public concern. People are already asking questions, and some of them are demanding action. Your mother needs to make a statement." Rachel's heart sank. "A statement?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you mean? She didn't do anything wrong." Caroline paused before responding, her voice lowering. "I understand that, Rachel. But the arrest, right now, the optics of it are problematic. The community is divided, and if we don't address this soon, it could become something bigger than any of us anticipated." Rachel clenched her fists, the weight of her responsibility suddenly hitting her full force. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about the town, about the systemic issues that had been exposed by one incident. Rachel knew what she had to do, but it wouldn't be easy. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Williams sat in her living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The television was on, but she wasn't really watching. Her mind kept replaying the moment when she had been dragged toward the patrol car. The anger and confusion had ebbed into something deeper, a quiet resolve that had begun to take root in her heart. She wasn't just the victim of a mistaken arrest, she was now a symbol of everything wrong with the way people were treated based on assumptions. She had spent her life trying to create harmony in a community that she loved, but now, it seemed, the very foundation of that harmony was being tested. Rachel entered the room, her expression somber. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, taking a seat beside her mother. Mrs. Williams turned to her daughter, sensing the gravity in her voice. "What's on your mind, Rachel?" "I spoke with the mayor's office," Rachel said, her words coming out in a rush. "They want you to make a public statement. Something to calm the community down. They're worried about how this is affecting the town." Mrs. Williams felt a knot form in her stomach. She had never been one for the spotlight, much less public statements. She had always preferred to stay out of the political limelight, never seeking attention or praise. But this situation was different. It wasn't just about her. It was about what had happened to her, and what it represented. "I won't make any statements to calm people down," Mrs. Williams replied firmly, her voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest. "I will speak the truth, Rachel, but not to quiet the masses. If people want answers, I'll give them. But it won't be because of fear or to smooth things over. It'll be because I've lived a life of honesty, and I will not let this lie stand." Rachel's eyes softened as she looked at her mother. She had always known her to be strong, but in this moment, she was more than just a mother, she was a beacon of strength, an example of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. The decision was made. Mrs. Williams would speak out, not just for herself, but for the people who had silently suffered in the shadows of systemic injustice, people whose voices had never been heard until now. The news spread quickly through Glenwood, and within hours, a crowd gathered at the community center, where Mrs. Williams had agreed to address the public. There was a mix of anticipation and skepticism in the air, as residents from all corners of the town gathered, some eager for answers, others wondering if the mayor's wife could provide any real insight into the issues that had been brought to light. As the crowd filed into the center, Rachel stood beside her mother, offering silent support. Mrs. Williams had always been a calm presence in their home, but today, she seemed different. There was a quiet fire in her eyes, a determination that Rachel hadn't seen before. She wasn't just addressing the crowd, she was speaking to a larger issue, one that had been building for years. When Mrs. Williams stepped to the microphone, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable as she began to speak, her voice clear and strong. "I am not here today to defend myself," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I am here because what happened to me yesterday is a reflection of a much larger problem. It is a problem that has been quietly festering in our community for far too long. And it's a problem that needs to be addressed, not just for me, but for all of us." She paused, letting her words sink in, before continuing. What happened yesterday was not just about a misunderstanding. It was about assumptions, about fear, and about a system that treats people differently based on their age, their race, and their status. It was wrong, and I will not sit idly by while that injustice goes unchallenged. The room remained still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It wasn't just Mrs. Williams who had been impacted by that moment, it was everyone in the room, everyone in Glenwood who had silently witnessed the way things had always been, and the way they could no longer remain. "I've spent my life serving this town," Mrs. Williams continued, her voice unwavering. "But now it's time for all of us to serve each other. We can no longer stand by and let things like this happen. We need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to make sure that this community is one where everyone, regardless of who they are, can walk the streets without fear." There was a long silence after she finished speaking, and for the first time in a long while, Glenwood felt like it was on the cusp of something monumental. Mrs. Williams had done what she had always done, she had spoken truthfully, without hesitation, and the entire town was listening. What came next would not just change her life, it would change the life of everyone who called Glenwood home. In the days following Mrs. Williams' speech, the town of Glenwood found itself at a crossroads. What had once been a quiet, almost idyllic community was now buzzing with the kind of energy that felt both unsettling and full of potential. The ripple effect of her words had stirred something deep within the hearts of the townspeople. Some were still reeling from the shock of the arrest and the way it had been handled, while others found themselves questioning the very fabric of the town's values. For Mrs. Williams, the attention was overwhelming at first. She had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be a public figure, but now, she was at the center of a storm that she hadn't expected. People from all walks of life were coming forward, offering support, but also questioning the future of the town. The media, both local and regional, had picked up the story, and suddenly, Glenwood was on the map in a way it had never been before. What was once a peaceful, almost forgotten town, nestled among the rolling hills of the state, was now the focal point of conversations about racial profiling, systemic inequality, and police accountability. But amidst all the attention, Mrs. Williams remained focused. Her resolve had only strengthened since that day, and she knew that her actions had ignited a conversation that couldn't be silenced. She had made a promise to herself and to the community that this wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of something greater, a movement for change that had long been needed, though never truly acknowledged until now. Meanwhile, Officer Harris was grappling with his own internal turmoil. His actions, while based on training and instinct, had caused irreparable harm. The image of Mrs. Williams' confused and scared face haunted him. He had spent days replaying the events in his mind, searching for a justification, any reason that might explain why he had reacted the way he did. But there was no excuse. He had acted rashly, allowing his own biases to cloud his judgment. It wasn't until he saw the public outcry, the way his actions had caused a rift in the community, that he fully grasped the gravity of the situation. In the days that followed, Harris became a figure of scorn in the town. His colleagues were divided. Some believed he had done nothing wrong, while others couldn't shake the feeling that something deeply wrong had occurred that day. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on her, but she knew that if she didn't step up, the fractures in Glenwood could grow deeper. The media had turned its gaze on her as well, sending reporters to her doorstep, hoping for sound bites or an exclusive that would shed more light on the mayor's family. But Rachel wasn't interested in drama. She was focused on the long-term impact. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and phone calls, Rachel sat down with her mother at the kitchen table, the weight of the last few weeks settling around them. The events had not just been difficult, they had shaken the very core of their family and their town. "Mom, what now?" Rachel asked, her voice tired but resolute. "What do we do next?" Mrs. Williams took a deep breath, her eyes thoughtful as she looked out the window. The evening light cast long shadows across the room, the quiet of the moment contrasting sharply with the noise and chaos of the past few weeks. "We keep moving forward," she said finally. "We have to be a part of the solution, Rachel. If we let this moment slip by without taking real action, then nothing will have changed." Rachel nodded, understanding her mother's words more deeply than she ever had before. Mrs. Williams had always been a woman of quiet strength, a woman who had never shied away from difficult decisions, even when they came at great personal cost. She knew this battle was far from over, and that they would need to keep pushing for change, no matter the resistance they faced. The town council meeting the following week was a turning point for Glenwood. Mrs. Williams, alongside her husband, the mayor, addressed a packed room of citizens, each one eager for answers. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with a mixture of frustration and hope. The council had become the stage for the community to air its grievances, but it was also the place where decisions would be made that could either heal or further divide the town. When Mrs. Williams took the floor, her calm presence filled the room, and once again, the crowd fell silent. She spoke not just as the mayor's wife, but as a mother, a neighbor, and a concerned citizen. "We cannot ignore the issues that this town faces anymore," she said, her voice unwavering. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, a pattern that needs to change. We cannot allow fear, prejudice, or assumptions to guide how we treat one another. The time for change is now, and I am here to lead that charge." Her words, strong and direct, struck a chord with many in the room. Some were moved to tears, while others found their voices to support her. The atmosphere in the room began to shift from skepticism to determination. Mrs. Williams' resolve had inspired something in them, a collective understanding that they all shared the responsibility for making their town a better place. At first, Harris tried to distance himself from the controversy, burying himself in his work in an attempt to move forward. But as the weeks wore on, it became increasingly impossible to ignore the mounting pressure. He started attending community meetings, hoping to find a way to make amends, though he was met with resistance and skepticism. Most residents still viewed him with distrust, unwilling to forgive him so easily for his actions. His attempts at reconciliation were often met with cold shoulders, and the bitterness that had been ignited between the police and the community was slow to dissipate. It wasn't until a particularly tense town hall meeting that Harris realized the depth of the divide. The mayor, ever the diplomatic figure, had encouraged him to speak, believing that confronting the people might be the first step toward healing. But when Harris stepped up to the microphone, the room grew silent, and the air thickened with tension. He looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some angry, and some confused, and he felt the weight of their judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the nervousness he felt inside. "I know that my actions have caused a great deal of pain and mistrust, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I was wrong. I didn't see the full picture that day, and I let my biases guide me. I failed you, and I failed myself." The room remained silent. Some of the older residents exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked directly at him, as if waiting for the apology to be followed by some sort of redemption. Harris continued, his words coming faster now, almost as if he were desperate to make them believe him. "But I want you to know that I am committed to learning, to understanding, and to making things right. I can't change what happened, but I can change how I approach my work, how I treat people, and how I view the world. I owe it to this community to do better." It was an honest admission, but whether or not it would be enough remained to be seen. The tension lingered in the air long after Harris finished speaking. Some members of the community seemed moved by his sincerity, while others remained skeptical, unsure of whether his apology was truly heartfelt or merely a way to regain their trust. It would take time to rebuild the fractured relationship between the police and the town, and even longer for the scars left by that single incident to fade. Meanwhile, Mrs. Williams continued to lead, not just by example, but with action. As mayor, she pushed for more initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. A community oversight board had been established, but now she wanted to go further. She fought for police training that focused not just on tactics, but on empathy, understanding, and cultural competence. She worked tirelessly to bring people together, organizing town forums where residents and officers could sit down face to face, share their experiences, and discuss how to move forward. There were moments of progress, but there were also setbacks. Not everyone was on board with her vision, and the opposition came from both sides. Some believed that she was pushing too hard, too fast. Others argued that it was too little, too late. But Mrs. Williams stood firm, knowing that the path to change was rarely smooth. Every small victory, every conversation where understanding began to replace animosity, was worth the struggle. As the months turned into a year, Glenwood began to show signs of healing. It wasn't a perfect town, and the scars of that day would never truly disappear, but the community had been forever altered. The people of Glenwood had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their town, and while that had been painful, it had also opened the door for growth. Officer Harris, too, began to change. His commitment to understanding the communities he served led him to seek out further training, attend cultural sensitivity courses, and volunteer in outreach programs. He had taken the first step by admitting his mistakes, but it was the work that followed that would define whether he could truly redeem himself in the eyes of the community. For Mrs. Williams, the journey was far from over. The challenges of leadership in a town divided were immense, but she had learned that change was possible, even in the face of deep resistance. She had learned that no victory came without sacrifice, but that each step forward was worth it. And as she looked out over the town she loved, she knew that while the road ahead would be long, the town of Glenwood had made its choice. It had chosen the path of truth, healing, and hope. The story of that day, the day when an elderly black woman was wrongfully arrested by a white officer, was no longer just a story of injustice. It had become a story of transformation, a story of a community coming together to confront its past, to hold itself accountable, and to rise from the ashes of conflict to create something stronger. Glenwood had been forever changed, and in that change, there was hope for the future. As the town of Glenwood entered a new chapter, the community found itself wrestling with both the triumphs and the lingering pains of the events that had unfolded. The months of hard work and dedication had begun to pay off, but the scars left by that single moment, when an elderly black woman was wrongfully arrested, remained a constant reminder of how far the town had come and how far it still had to go. Mrs. Williams had remained steadfast in her pursuit of justice, but the process of healing was slow and filled with setbacks. While the leadership she provided had been instrumental in reshaping the town, the journey of reconciliation was ongoing, and it would take more than just a few speeches and policies to restore trust. Officer Harris, now seen as a man determined to atone for his past mistakes, was still viewed by many with suspicion. Though he had worked tirelessly to repair his relationships with the residents of Glenwood, some still couldn't shake the image of him handcuffing Mrs. Williams that fateful day. For Harris, the pressure of his past actions hung over him every day, and while some of the townspeople had begun to see his efforts as genuine, others remained wary. Yet, he didn't stop trying. He spent more time out of the office, engaging with the community, volunteering for local events, and working with programs designed to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the citizens. He spoke at schools, sharing his own story of learning and growth, trying to teach young people the importance of empathy and understanding. But no matter how many good deeds Harris performed, there were still those who saw him as nothing more than a symbol of the town's failure. For them, his apology and actions were not enough. They needed more: reparations, apologies from those in power, a complete overhaul of the way things had always been done. There was no quick fix, no immediate solution to the years of tension that had been building in Glenwood, and it became increasingly clear that this was a marathon, not a sprint. Mrs. Williams, too, found herself at the crossroads of her own personal journey. As the mayor's wife, she had been thrust into the spotlight in a way that she had never expected. She had assumed the role of a fierce advocate for change, but it came at a personal cost. The emotional toll of leading a community through such a difficult time began to weigh heavily on her. While she was proud of the progress that had been made, there were days when she questioned whether it was worth it. The long hours, the public scrutiny, the endless meetings, it was exhausting. Her family, too, had felt the strain. Her daughters, once carefree and removed from the daily grind of politics, had now taken on more responsibility in the community. Rachel, especially, had become a pillar of support for her mother, but the pressure on both of them was palpable. The town's needs were growing, and it seemed as though there was always more work to be done. One evening, after a particularly exhausting council meeting, Mrs. Williams found herself in the quiet solitude of her home, reflecting on the toll the events had taken on her. The phone rang, and her heart sank when she saw the caller ID. It was Officer Harris. She had heard little from him recently, and though she had encouraged him to continue his path toward change, there had been little contact. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Mrs. Williams," Harris began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. I don't expect it, not yet. But I just wanted you to know that I'm still trying. I haven't given up on trying to make this right. I know there's a long road ahead, but I wanted to tell you that I'm committed to doing the work, for you, for the town, for myself." There was a long pause before Mrs. Williams responded, her voice quiet but resolute. "I believe you, Harris. I do. But the work doesn't just fall on your shoulders. It's on all of us. You're not the only one who needs to change, not the only one who needs to do better." "I understand," Harris replied. I needed you to hear that." After they hung up, Mrs. Williams sat in silence, the weight of the conversation lingering. It wasn't easy to forgive him, not after what had happened, but she knew he was trying. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to begin the healing process. She thought back to the first time she had stood before the town, speaking not just about herself, but about all of them. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that the path to real change was not about erasing the past but confronting it head-on and learning from it. Harris was trying, and that effort, however small, could be the spark that finally ignited the transformation Glenwood so desperately needed. In the following months, Glenwood continued to evolve. Mrs. Williams worked tirelessly to implement programs that brought the community together. The town saw an increase in neighborhood events, educational outreach programs, and efforts to involve people from all walks of life in conversations about race, justice, and community. The oversight board that had been established became a powerful tool for accountability, ensuring that the police force could no longer operate unchecked. There was still resistance, of course, change was never easy, but the momentum was undeniable. One evening, as the sun began to set over Glenwood, Mrs. Williams walked with her daughters down the same street where the incident had taken place. They passed the same storefronts, the same familiar faces, but the air felt different. There was a new sense of unity in the town, a feeling that hadn't existed before. People smiled at each other on the street, waved from their porches, and greeted one another with warmth. It was a small change, but to Mrs. Williams, it meant everything. It meant that Glenwood was healing, slowly but surely. The road had been long, and there was still work to be done, but they had come a long way. And in that moment, as she walked with her daughters, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had turned a corner. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that Glenwood had found its path, one where justice, accountability, and empathy could finally flourish. As she gazed out over the horizon, Mrs. Williams couldn't help but smile, knowing that while the town's journey wasn't over, they had taken the most important step, they had started. And for that, she was grateful.